Hello, Catrin. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Hi there, Emma. Lovely to be here.
So, can you introduce yourself a bit then by just telling us a bit about your journey into Quakers and how long ago that was? And what we're really interested in is what were you seeking and what did you find? So, what made you stay?
Okay, really good question. I grew up in a Quaker family, um, but I think the things at that stage, as a young person, were about the relationships with other young people. Um, I was um, I was in South Wales from a single parent mixed race family at a time when that really when there was a lot of prejudice and you felt quite an outsider at school and in lots of communities. And in the meeting and in South Wales Junior Young Friends and in Midlands Young Friends, there was a whole alternative community um, of friends, of inclusion, of excitement, of big brothers, of weekends away being independent, of engaging, I think, with adults in a very different way. You know, humble learners in the school of Christ, adults sharing their journeys. And So I suppose that was in my early teens. It was a lovely community. Um, And then as I suppose later teens, there were similar things, but on a national scale. Um, Young Friends General Meeting, so Young Friends Cultural Committee as it then was, so a national body coming together for business, getting to know, I suppose, other young Quakers aged up to about 30, 35, um, and a sense of business being done and of really good conversations about superficial stuff, but also about what was going on in people's lives and how people were being changed by that. Um, so I suppose, yeah, the question again was why did I say so? I suppose at that stage, and then at university, I studied in Manchester, where there's a thriving Quaker community. Again, very grounded Quakers, I think more of the same. Um, in my I suppose in my 20s, I'd studied modern languages. So then I worked outside the UK for the next 10 years, um, in Germany, in Belgium. Um, and I suppose, and I'd studied in West Berlin. So at a time when the wall was up. So that gave the chance to worship with friends in West Berlin and in East Berlin and in East Germany. So I suppose through my 20s, there was an awful lot of a sense of conversations with people whose lives had been dramatically different, where their faith, where being a Quaker had had really dramatic impacts for the life choices that they had, for who they were. Um, and I suppose also so I was in Brussels for a long time, um, for a year as a volunteer at Quaker Council for European Affairs. And there I and my fellow programme assistants, so we were early 20s, and we we were the people really who hosted the midweek meeting. Um, and it suddenly dawned on us that hosting the midweek meeting and actually in the meeting for worship as well, though it was quite a large meeting for worship, but we suddenly realized actually we were the people who had the longest standing Quaker grounding, who were there most of the time. So it's a bit of a long-winded way of coming back, I think, to your question. But actually, it was when I was in Belgium that I applied for membership, because there was just that sense that actually here I can see more clearly what I've got to offer. I not not with any sense of being better than, but just a clearer sense of actually, I'm clear of what I've got to contribute here that other people maybe have understood somewhat differently, or are asking in a way that in the UK at that point, there would often be other very grounded friends in the room.
Mm. Mm.
So remind me again of the question. It was, why do I stay, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, because we continually come back, don't we?
Yeah.
And so the question was, what are you seeking and what are you
Yes.
finding?
Yeah. So I think what I'm seeking and what I'm finding now, I think what I seek is very much the grounded worship. I get, at its best, I get a great deal from um, that grounded worship together. Um, what I'm finding as well are the the ministry from others sharing their grapplings, what they're finding, their encounters with the spirit. Um, and I think what I also really value is that sense that it's not just a one-off thought for the day. You're hearing these sharings from other fallible people who um, when it's not 11 to 12 on a Sunday. Um, so that sense of them continuing to grapple with this conversation as well, rather than it being something that's spruced up and on thought for the day. Um,
Mm.
so I think that sense of the relationships, that getting to know each other in that which is eternal, some of the time, that is what I really value. Um, that sense, I think, it's really interesting. I'm now back in the meeting that I grew up in as a child, and there's something very powerful about being back in that meeting room and remembering the grounded Quakers who ministered when I was 4, when I was 6, when I was 11. Um, and so that sense of the kind of the models and the patterns of some people, how this all changed their lives, how they let it change their lives, who, I'm late 50s, who I would like to be more like, um, you know, as we choose where to prioritize.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I suppose lastly, I suppose the griefs in my own life and the joys in my own life, um, Quaker worship has been, um, it's been a context where it's been possible much of the time to be myself as well, and for that to feel held. And that it's not always been the case, but I do think that 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 for me has felt very powerful too.
Mm. Mm. Gosh, it's so interesting. Can I go back to a phrase you used in the very first few minutes, which was all being humble learners in the school of Christ? I'm just wondering, I've heard that phrase somewhere, but I'm not sure it's one that I use. I'm just wondering, what made you choose that phrase? Is that something that you heard a lot? And what does it mean to you?
And I wouldn't say it's something that I've heard a lot, but it does resonate for me. Um, I think it. I think some of what it means for me is that we're all on a level together, aren't we? That humility. We've all got um, we've all got a part of the truth. We all listen to it, but there isn't that hierarchy of I'm a parent, I'm a child. Or when I was in Brussels, I'm a director general of, that 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 isn't what. what's at play here in our relationships together. And certainly as a teenager, that felt very powerful.
Yeah, I can see what you mean. Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't grow up amongst Quakers. So, I arrived in my, say, 32. So I don't have that experience of being really young and noticing those age differences and those power differences, really. And what I'm hearing you say is that you felt very much like an equal morally, if you like, or spiritually,
Yeah,
and that you had a part to play and a place in that.
yeah, that's really well, yeah, really well paraphrased. Yes, I think, yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head. And that for me, certainly in Brussels, that was what the realization I was coming to, I think. Yes.
So in Brussels, then, you were in your 20s alongside a few other workers who were also in their 20s, all Quakers, perhaps all grown up in Quakers as well. So with 20 odd years of Quaker experience, and I think what you're saying is you're in a room with a variety of people who are perhaps very new to Quakers, but they're in their 50s and the Director General of whatever. So are you saying that it was a large meeting with powerful and impressive older people, and but you were aware of what you said your groundedness maybe or your experience. Tell me a bit more about what the context was and what that was.
Yeah, so Brussels meeting was set up, I think in the probably late 70s, early 80s, because there was a recognition by um, some British Quakers who'd gone to work in the European com- well, Commission, as it then was, um, or the European Community, as it then was, um, that it was really it would be really important to have a Quaker presence there, um, because lots of powerful concerns were lobbying, but NGOs at that stage were doing much less. Um, and I suppose by the time I and Liz, my counterpart, were there, I think the main thing I was conscious of was in the midweek meeting. Um, so it was held every Wednesday at lunchtime. And of course, for the vast majority of people, they were in their working day. So it wasn't that the meeting had set it up, but it wasn't that anybody else from the meeting was necessarily there. So we might be there when you might have, well, you would have regularly visitors who were interested in Quakerism, who'd come for the first time, or people who were in periods of considerable mental distress who'd come, um, or who were asking, in French, well, so can you tell us about Quakerism then? Or there was also, it was the time when there was a film about the Amish. I can't remember what it was called. So there was an awful lot of trying to explain in our mangled French at that point the theological differences between Quakers and the Amish. So I suppose there was that. I think it was particularly at the Wednesday midweek meeting that it was very clear we were that standing presence, and actually we were being pulled beyond our where we felt really confident, but it was really important what we were doing. But also I think in the business meetings, in in Brussels meeting at that time, because people worked together in the same kind of context, I think it's quite difficult then changing how you how you clerk a meeting when you're very used to doing things together in the way that the European community does things. So there was just this sense of, yeah, Quaker culture being also different country, yeah, different language, different. So also a different Quaker culture there, which was completely appropriate, but just that sense that actually we've probably got something to contribute here.
And what do you remember about that then? In terms of, is there any more you can say about how you feel the Quaker presence there had an impact? Because, I mean, I don't know what it was like to work there at that time. And obviously, I can imagine there was lots of big and important discussions. But can you give us a sense of the kinds of things the Quaker presence might have had an impact?
I think it felt a really exciting time. There was a sense that, for example, around things like conscientious objection, um, that previous Quaker representatives had really, got together and created, not created, but ensured that the rights of conscientious objectors were really recognised more at a European level, and created a focus for that. I think one of the things that I took away that I hadn't realised, you don't realise your own preconceptions, do you? I'd studied German. I'd been with German Quakers. I'd understood that, German was a language of Quakerism too. I'd got that, but I remember just being very conscious of ministry and translation and the language of Quakerism in French, or in Flemish, or um, that 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 was that was that was very powerful for me. So in Brussels meeting, for example, when you were on the door, as doorkeeper, and you welcomed people, part of your role was, yes, understanding, are they new to Quakerism? Do you need to explain things? But also, what languages do they feel confident in? And depending on the language that they spoke and what their which other languages they spoke, you had a flower to pin on the curtain, in the meeting room. So it was clear that if ministry was in one language or another, there'd be a need to be interpretation to another language. um, and things like that I thought were very, it was really interesting, the sense that Quakerism is being developed by all of us.
Yeah. So what are the differences then? In like what do you remember of the how Quaker culture is in French or in German? What how give me a sense of what that means.
um, I think in Germany, for example, well, there were lots of translations. This was a time as well when faith and practice was being translated into different languages as well, and so some of the translations, and I can't remember the words now, but there
Mm.
was a lot of discussion about, does this really hit the spot, or doesn't this, or this is how, and this comes from the biblical translation of something that, as a second language speaker, you wouldn't have been aware of. Um, but for example, I remember being at Germany Yearly Meeting one year, um, and the minute being brought back. I think the discussion was around, it was around inclusion and welcoming people into into people's homes. I think it was around, asylum. Um, and I remember, a young friend standing up and saying, I'd really like to object to this minute because this isn't what we're doing. And again, it was very it was very appropriate in the German culture, where it's very important to be where people are very direct.
Mm.
But I was just really conscious that it's not that that would have been being done in the UK context either, but that wouldn't have happened in a UK dots and commas kind of discussion. There was a greater directness.
Mm.
Um, um,
I
yeah.
wish we were more direct in the UK, Catrin. I think we could do with a bit of German directness.
Yes, but that's a work in progress, maybe.
Uh, yeah, maybe. I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously, I don't think you're a Welsh speaker of any fluency, perhaps your French is better. But I'm just wondering, what do you make now of the Welsh language in Quaker meetings? Do you have any observations of how welcoming we are to those who are perhaps more comfortable and confident in Welsh? Um, do you have a sense of how we do that?
I feel too new back in Wales. So I've been back in Swansea for uh 6 months, and I'm no, you're right. I'm not fluent. I'm relearning Welsh. Um, I I think we're trying. Um, and I think it's really, in Swansea meeting, I think it's really, it's really good that we welcome people at the door in Welsh. We so I think we're trying. I think it's really difficult because I don't know who the Welsh speakers are in Swansea meeting. And so actually I'd love to speak a bit more Welsh, but I don't know. And I think that's something that I think in an English speak, a predominantly English speaking area like Swansea, that's quite challenging as well, isn't it? We need to have different coloured lanyards or something, so it's really clear.
So how would you, given your background then, because I didn't know this about you and your linguist experience of managing these translations, how would you think what advice would you give in terms of how we might manage it? Because I do know that there are sometimes Welsh speakers who would love to be able to minister in Welsh, but feel a bit inhibited because they know there's only three or four people in the room who are going to follow that. How would you advise that we managed that then, as best we could? Yeah, I know it wouldn't be perfect.
Well, I mean, certainly the experience of, and in fact, so the experience of Brussels meeting, and also the experience, in European and Middle East young friends that I was very involved with, and actually Swansea meeting when I was growing up, you minister first in the language that you feel at home in, um, and then you translate it, or somebody else can translate it, or if it can't be translated, that's as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I and so, for example, in European and Middle East young friends, that I was very involved. I was clerk of in my 20s for a few years, and there we covered the whole of Europe and the. Well, I mean, when I say we covered, but we had members from many different European countries, and there would be and it was at the time when Eastern Europe, um, people were starting to come from Eastern Europe, but um, didn't speak um, English, because the language had been Russian, the foreign language that people learned had been Russian. So there was, so what would happen in our informal conversations or whatever, would do a tea if they needed translation. Um, and we would kind of so you would say it in the mother tongue, and then and you would put this so people would know to be listening more, and then they would translate for you or interpret for you into a language that you could follow in.
Wow. That's great. I mean, would you ever have used and would you advocate now having, like on TV, like much like you're wearing now, these little headsets, and you can hear that people are just wearing them all the time and they're getting immediate translation, simultaneous translation, as it's called. Would you recommend that for if there was a very large meeting? Is that the model that you think would be the best way to manage a Quaker meeting? So that, or do you think there's a real benefit to what you've just described?
I'm not I don't know. I wouldn't feel confident saying. I think personally, we found it worked really well, the human mediated way. Um, but this was at a time when you didn't have headsets. So who's to say it might just have
Of
been
course.
old school? I don't know, Emma. That's a really good question. I think I'd need to think more about that.
Yeah, of course, the time before it had to be human mediated, didn't it? Whereas now we have this technology. You see, it's really interesting that I grew up in Carmarthenshire, which is just a bit further west and a bit more Welsh. And I grew up with what you're describing. I grew up with this idea of you'd speak in your most comfortable language, and well, I mean, the English speakers with not much Welsh would just speak in English. But the Welsh speakers, of course, they would speak in Welsh and then they would, as you say, kind of translate, but it wouldn't be a direct translation. And for when you could understand both languages, you would know they're saying something slightly different and it's a slight continuation, but it's a richness then. So if you're bilingual, you're getting twice the content, but the English listeners didn't feel left out because they got the translation and it was enough. And it all carried on in a very smooth way. And my experience in Carmarthenshire is that that still happens and it's just perfectly normal. It's just a perfectly normal part of life. And I went to an ordination ceremony a few weeks ago in Llandilo, and that's what happened. And, with my hearing problem, my Welsh isn't good enough to understand everything anyway. But as an English, mainly predominantly English user, I don't feel like I'm missing out. Now, would you feel that would work in a Quaker meeting?
I think
Um,
that would be great. Yeah, I think that would be really good,
because
personally.
if people feel confident in both languages, it seems to me to be possible. I suppose I'll need to ask Welsh speakers about
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but certainly for, if somebody spoke in Welsh and then English and then back to Welsh and then back to English, how would you feel about that?
I'd really like that. But I think, in a sense, it's probably not you or I you know, who are confident with Welsh. It might be interesting to know how those people who are predominantly English speaking I mean, predominantly and solely English speaking might feel about it as well.
Is that because you would understand some of the Welsh?
Yes, and I'm committed to furthering the language too. So I'm interested in it anyway. I mean, I get the importance of speaking people speaking in their mother tongue. So that's a first thing for me. And I'm also interested in the language. So I think I'm kind of on one end of the spectrum. Um,
Right. So you would say because we are both supporters of the language, and if we understood maybe 10% or maybe 50% or maybe 90% of the Welsh, you see, I would feel positive about that because I'm either understanding a more richer experience, but I know that the English speakers are not being left out completely because it's then going into English. For me, that's a wonderful scenario that is genuinely supportive of the language. So it's been really interesting to get your views on that.
no, smash it. But I mean, I think the thing. So it's important to say as well in Brussels meeting, for example, while this was the practice at that stage, there was a bit of a, but I come here for the silence. So again, I think some of what the that obviously that wasn't me saying that, but that was what some of the mumbling in the room was sometimes. And so how we were then explaining was that, what we're doing in meeting for worship, the silence is a vehicle, but we're doing it to listen to the spirit, and it matters therefore as much as possible to be able to explain, what the ministry is about. But there was quite a sense that, these translations, which are not very brilliant, sometimes they're taking quite a lot of the silence time.
I see.
So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so just to
There's
feed that
always
in.
there's always tensions and trade-offs, isn't there? Yeah. And I think that is the case. I think that is the case in Quakers in Wales as well. And well, any church group in Wales, these are the kinds of issues we have to think about. Can I go back then? You said something about how, as young people, you were really quite a core part of Brussels meeting, and that was on a Wednesday lunchtime with people you worked with, really. And I was interested in how you sustained yourselves. I mean, I know in your 20s we're full of boundless energy and we don't get tired, but I just wondered if there was something we could hear from you about, if you're at work and then you have to go into a Quaker meeting and work there as well, really. Did you also go to a meeting on a Sunday which was more, I don't know, more restful, or you could take a bit more of a back seat? And was that an important thing in terms of finding somewhere else where you're also then nourished personally.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think I was grateful it was just a year that I was in that role. And so I and my counterpart, we shared a flat as well. So there was, there was a lot of, I mean, we're still very good friends, but there was a lot of time together. Um, so yes, we went to meeting as well and had friendships separately. And I think we made a point of doing things separately. Even though we might have both liked to do the same things, but we to just to get that distance. I think for me, yeah, the meeting for worship. You're right. It did have a different dynamic, and that was nourishing. And European and Middle East young friends, that felt very nourishing. I suppose meeting counterparts from different countries, having those conversations, um, that felt that did feel really important. There was a something wanted to say and I've forgotten you. I think also because Quaker House in Brussels, it offered cheap accommodation, and so we'd have lots of people from the NGO world and other and Quakers from all over Europe, all over the world, coming and staying. Um, so that was also really nourishing. Whether it was somebody who was, I don't know, cycling around Europe in to further the cause of Esperanto, or people who were working for Oxfam and lobbying on, about famine in Somalia or whatever. We had some really interesting conversations, just which again were really, really very nourishing.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it sounds like an amazing experience. The reason why I was asking that was it made me think of, in we hear that some meetings are perhaps having a declining membership, and the people who are active are very active and having to do everything. And I've just been aware recently that some people are seeing a Sunday morning quite a lot like work, in that there's a lot of work to do, there's a lot of preparation to do, there's a lot of upholding and kind of that emotional labor of holding the space for others, listening to their concerns, maybe taking some flack sometimes. You shouldn't have done it like that. What do
Yeah.
and absorbing all of that. And actually, by Sunday lunchtime, getting home and feeling really quite exhausted by it. And where then is the spiritual nourishment when you've got that endless work, really, and the giving out? And I just wondered if you had any insights into that, given that you'd had that experience back then.
I think that's really true, isn't it? And I remember somebody saying in ministry a while ago when they were saying, lots of people say coming to meeting is like coming home, but somebody's got to be changing the sheets, and um, and it is like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sometimes, um, and
Yeah.
I think it's really important to be articulating that, because there is. I mean, we're speaking just after Christmas, and one of the things I was reflecting on in meeting for worship was about the pressures of being mum at Christmas, and getting getting the food on the table that meets the dietary requirements, and it, and that isn't what Christmas is about, and it shouldn't be what our meeting for worship is about. It shouldn't be that one person is having to be responsible for everything. But I do think that there is that risk, isn't there? So I think in terms of nourishment, well, I think support groups matter, don't they?
Mm.
I found time at other meetings, um, where you could be undercover incognito. Um, that was really helpful. Um, and I do think saying, um, so that maybe others can take some of the slack.
Mm.
but I think as well, it's difficult, isn't it? I think we're going to need to simplify our structure. I think we need to be, of course, there's always work to be done, but I think that sometimes there's a bit of a sense that it needs to be done to other people's standards. And it should be all right to do things, to do what we can do willingly, and be clear where that finishes, and step back and hope that others will take it on.
So when you say simplifying, I mean, I think this is a movement that's been happening for a while now, and we're trying, aren't we, nationally to do that. What do you think are the things that we need to still simplify further?
I'm not very good at organizational thinking and so on, but um, I suppose uh, I think we need to make it possible that it's possible to be in full-time work, and to come to meeting every week and not feel that there's too much of the work ethos around it. And I'm new in the meeting at the moment, so I come gladly and I don't feel that, but I would worry that some people who work full time, and probably other people who are retired and have taken on major roles, probably feel there's rather more of the work ethos around Quakerism than they might like.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because if we didn't exist and we all got together and thought, oh, that's a good idea, let's start a Quaker meeting, we wouldn't have this so much pressure on ourselves, and we certainly wouldn't have an enormous building with a garden and all sorts of other things to take care of. What's your view on meeting houses?
Well, do you know what? But just to come back to what you were saying there, I think that's true. And you think of the Valiant 60 and so on. But again, I do think there's a bit about Quaker mythologies as well, aren't there? For example, when I was part of Welwyn Garden City, and you'd hear about great Quakers who did really important things in Welwyn Garden City in the 30s and 40s, set up major things, and you did find yourself thinking, but I wonder how they had the energy to do that. And then you realise, reading more, that actually they had other people in their family who were earning the income, and they were doing. So I just think it's important as well to be really clear about, was it just that actually there were women who were doing those things while other people went off and did big Quaker work? Is that possibly the case?
Yeah.
Sorry, so what you were asking about meeting houses?
Well, I mean, no, I mean, it's all,
Yeah.
isn't it? I was just wondering, as you say, someone's got to wash the sheets, someone's got to do the household stuff. Um, and if you've got a large meeting house or even any meeting house at all, that does it, there's more stuff to be done.
Yes.
Um, and I just wondered if you know, do you think that we have too many buildings? Do you think we should? What's your sense at the moment about how that needs to move forward over the next few years?
It's difficult, isn't it? It's not my ministry. I'm not very good at that kind of thing, and for me it's not the heart of our collective ministry. I think for me the worship, and what stems from the worship in terms of our lives, that for me is the central bit.
Yeah.
I don't mean to dismiss the really, the really important work others do, but I would worry if we end up being maybe a smaller body which has many, many listed buildings, and we become a faith body that is servicing our listed buildings. That wouldn't be where I would see our future.
So how would you feel then about if we weren't in these big buildings, but we were renting space in a community hall or whatever? Would that change meeting for worship for you?
Well, it wouldn't for me, but I am very grateful on a really deep emotional level. I am very grateful to be back in the childhood meeting house that I grew up. And I suppose I'm also conscious. I'm also a Woodbrooke trustee, um, and again, I had deep emotional um, gratitude, memories to the physical Woodbrooke College, um, and great sadness along with so many others that we had to step away from from that physical center. So I do very much value them as well. But if we had to make a choice, we're having to make choices in so many
Mm.
at times of austerity in so many that for me would not, you know, not
Yeah.
all our meeting houses need to be kept, I would say, for me.
What do you think of this idea? Well, one of the things that I believe is that the way in which you allow these processes to unfold is by not propping up the things that are not sustainable. So what I mean by that is if you don't think that something should continue, but you're still paying in £15 a month to keep it going. Well, the first thing you've got to do is stop paying £15 in a month to keep it going. And gradually, more and more people will realize that that's not the thing that, where we want to put our money in. And it's the same goes for our time and our energy. And and I wonder if this kind of, putting your money where your mouth is or letting the energy lead is just so important. And you shouldn't feel any sense of guilt about that because I've stopped putting money into certain things. And I do feel conflicted about it still. But ultimately, I think we won't make difficult decisions about letting some buildings go unless it becomes wholly obvious that we just don't have the money to carry on doing this. If we do keep having the money, we'll never make those decisions. And it's the same with the energy and the roles and if you can't keep a role going because nobody will do it, well then it just has to be laid down. And it seems to me that rather than being powered by guilt and keeping things going, we should just be abandoning that and letting the energy flow to where the spirit leads. How does that sound to you? Does that come across as a bonkers kind of selfish idea?
No, I think I really hear where you're coming from. I think for me, where it resonates most is around the energy and about the not. Of course, there are, somebody's got to do the filing too. I'm not saying we can only do the bits that we really like, um, but I, I'm at a stage of life where I'm thinking, yeah, some roles where it really doesn't play to my strengths and I don't feel I've got the energy. Yeah, I have recently said no to something, and that I did, you know, I sat with it for a while. It wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, but I did think that was in right ordering for me and for the other things that I've got on my plate at the moment. I think with the money, again, that is what I do in different bits of my life. I give money to where I see there's potential. Like you, I feel more conflicted about that in a Quaker context, and particularly around the buildings, because I think it's probably likely that other people's money then goes to it instead. But I'd certainly, I just think I'd need to think about it all a bit more. But certainly with the energy side, yeah, I do agree.
Yeah. So you said about the spirit being the most important and worship. Can I ask you a bit about that then? When you say worship, what are you worshipping? And when you say spirit, do you mean the Holy Spirit?
Oh, I'm never very good with definitions.
Well,
Um,
it's not. Well,
okay,
what do
yeah.
you worship? Is it the spirit? Is it the Holy Spirit of the Bible? What is worship to you? Are you worshipping God?
I'm worshipping God. I'm sitting. I think, hmm,
I mean, I'm wondering how Christian this is, you know? Is this a
yeah,
Christian, typical Christian?
I think it has been for me in the past. I'm not saying that's actively where it is for me now. I think what I'm what I'm doing, what I'm worshipping, I'm sitting and I'm thinking back through the last week and what I'm grateful for in the last week, where I feel I've encountered the spirit in the last week, um, where I felt distant from the spirit in the last week. Um, so for me, yes, that would be about God, but it's not at the moment in Christ's language for me. For me, it's more like, I don't know, walking on the seashore and, the waves coming and wiping things clean, or um, and throwing up bits of driftwood and things as well. It's not just about me, it's about what's going on in the meeting too. Um,
Because it's really interesting, you know, so many people in Quaker meeting nowadays are not using Christian language. But I did notice that it was a very early use of the phrase, as I mentioned. It really struck me, humble learners in the school of Christ. And I just wondered how much of that language and culture and maybe contents of the Bible and the stories, whether that still impacts upon you, or have you moved into a more, um, more generic spiritual language?
I it does it has enriched me in the past. Our children went to an Anglican school, and so as part and that was a lovely community. And so twice a week I went to the Anglican services there, which were lovely. So that very much enriched me in a different way alongside meeting for worship.
Mm.
And I was a Quaker in Kenya for 4 years. So that there it was it was very Bible based, and
Mm.
Welling Garden City meeting was very Bible based as well. So there has been it has been enriched when I've been alongside others for whom that's been the predominant um, way of seeing things, and that has enriched me. But it's not. Um, I wouldn't say it's at the forefront for me at
No,
the
no.
moment.
And the other thing you mentioned that was important to you was the way it transforms life, the way it changes us. That was one of the descriptions you gave. Is that still true now? Because you were saying that about the Brussels meeting, but is that how you see the benefit of meeting? Is how it changes us? And what do you mean by that?
Um, I think it. I mean, I think in a small scale way, when I leave meeting for worship, I feel in a different place from when I went in. Um, and sometimes when there have been big decisions in my life or big changes, they've come to crystallization in meeting for worship. There's that sense of getting a distance from what's been preoccupying you, and things just being seen in a different way there. But again, in Swansea meeting when I was a child, you saw members of the meeting doing really courageous things, standing in a very conservative area for Labour as councillor again and again, being clear that you weren't going to get many votes. It was a lot of hard work, but it mattered to give people a choice. um, people of my parents' generation, um, decide being feeling called to go and work in Bogota in Colombia. And so giving up stable jobs and going and doing that. People doing really um, I remember being at Woodbrooke one weekend, um, and the ecumenical accompaniers who were going and supporting people in Palestine and in Israel. They just finished their training period, and they were about to go off, and we all gave them a round of applause. And that sense of people doing things that in the lives of in the views of the world might be being seen as being foolhardy, or why would you do that now you're about to retire? Well, don't is why don't you go on a cruise instead? And people doing that kind of thing. So yeah, that is some of what I get from meeting for worship, and being alongside others who are doing things that wouldn't necessarily be my calling.
Yeah. Yeah, and it just makes things possible that you just wouldn't have thought possible, really. I'm just
Yeah.
wondering then to finish off, what are your hopes or your fears for the future of Quakers in Britain?
Well, I think actually it's because I think something that I haven't really said, that I've had a long period away from Quakerism. So I was in Kenya, I came back, had a marriage breakup, was a single mum, moved to a new area of the country, was supporting teenage children who'd been through a lot of difficult transition. Um, and though I myself felt a grounded Quaker, I was in a new area of the country. I couldn't go to my old meeting for worship. Didn't have an awful lot of time. And meeting for worship, silent worship, when I was quiet with myself, what I was doing was big, snotty crying, howling. Um, and so there was a period of about 10 years where I couldn't be in meeting for worship because I didn't want to get to know a new group of friends in something where you feel quite bare when what you're doing is being quite howly and disruptive. Even though I would have we were in a very precarious place at that stage, and the friends locally, they were lovely and they did offer support, and they were grounded people, but it didn't feel possible to be me in meeting for worship at that time.
Mm.
So I suppose that for me is a big fear about, actually it's about precarity, it's about who we are. Is it only possible to be a Quaker in Britain with our mode of worship if you're in a fairly stable situation? I
Mentally
worry about
and
that.
emotionally.
Well, mentally, emotionally, financially, at that stage I was freelancing as well as working full time, didn't have any energy to give at any level beyond that. So I think that for me there's a thing there about fears. I think hopes.
Well, can I just ask a bit
Yeah,
more about that then? So you said, so financially, what, I mean, that's just fascinating what you just said. So is it only possible to be a Quaker in Britain if you're stable and you're thinking about financially, economically, as well as perhaps emotionally? So, I mean, are you saying that people don't have the time to devote on Sunday mornings because they might be working? Is that one of the things you're talking about?
yeah. It felt to me. It, it felt to me that my first duty was stability for our family, um, and a bit of joy for our family. So, things like, with teenagers, we'd have pancakes on a Sunday morning and we might actually not snarl at each other because there would be a little bit more time. So there was that felt the most important thing, because the pressures of the week for the rest of the week were very present. Um, but also, yeah, financially, if I was freelancing a bit on a Saturday, you just needed that Sunday just to bounce back a bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And were you also saying something about when we're not in an emotional or mental state to be able to, not just fall apart, if you like, in a meeting, which is lots of people will feel like that. I mean, were you saying that you also didn't feel you could sit in a silent meeting because you were so emotional at that period, and you felt excluded at that, or you self?
I didn't feel excluded. I self-excluded. I think it was appropriate to self-exclude myself. I just think it's what I did was, I'd go on long walk. If there was a bit of time, it felt much more appropriate to go on a long walk on a local common where you could howl
Yeah,
and be snotty
yeah,
rather than be
yeah.
a rather new disruptive person in the meeting.
Yeah, yeah. It's a shame though, isn't it, in a way? I mean, and I do know people do get emotional in meetings, but I take your point. Take your point.
Well, I think they probably dodged a bullet, but I think there's a thing there, isn't there, about um, how how we be more inclusive. I'm conscious at the moment with a family member who's got a recent onset disability, and conversations there where you know them feeling actually it all feels a bit much pressure to be in meeting where they might be disruptive, and
Hmm.
it's kind of like, but does that matter?
It
um
it really shouldn't matter, should it? I
I think
really
it
do
shouldn't
wish
matter
we
either,
were.
but no, but I think it shouldn't matter either, and I think that's not. But then I remember how I felt when I was, in that, in a howly stage. So anyway, I suppose I'm just musing about
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
I would agree. I think that's not the core of what Quakerism is about. But nonetheless, when we feel a bit less certain and shaky. So I think my hopes and fears, I think I would hope I personally have been massively enriched by my um, encounters with friends from other European countries and the rest of the world.
Hmm.
I'd hope that those kind of person to person international encounters, um, that could be more the case.
Yeah.
Um, I work at the Open University. I'm a careers consultant there. We do a lot online with forums. So, for example, at the moment, I'm um, I'm moderating two module forums. So there's 4,000 students on each module, um, and we're having careers conversations. Um, One to many. So there's 4,000 students, and there's me moderating each of these. And people are having peer to peer conversations, and I'm feeding in little bits of information while people talk about what's on there. What their goals might be, what they're wondering about, they're throwing questions out to the community. And I think this would be a great model for friends
Mm.
to have, to have conversations about what's going on for us in our spiritual life. Um, Again, in my work life, um, careers work is a lot about entry ramps and exit ramps. What brought me back to Quakerism was somebody, you know, asking me to do something. Um, and I think it's quite easy to fall off from coming to meeting for worship. And I think if we had more entry ramps, more ways that it were possible to get the real inspiration, to have spiritual friendship, maybe weekends, maybe weeks together, those kind of things, like yearly meeting, residential gathering. Um,
Yeah.
I think that could be really powerful and really important as well. Um, And I think, yeah, making more of online worship, making more of online communities. One of the reasons that I think Quakerism works very well if you're in a stable geographic location, and where it's been much more challenging for me has been where I've been peripatetic, or I haven't felt in a settled place geographically, and it's felt like a big move to transfer my membership from somewhere that where I did feel settled to the precarious, or the less settled place where I currently am. So I kind of think us doing more about that, I think, could be really important as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah. Wow, that's such an interesting range of ideas, and of course, it comes from your professional experience as well, um, stemming all the way back from Brussels to now 4,000 students in a room on on a conversation. I cannot imagine. But yeah, there's such a lot in there. I love that idea of entry ramps and exit ramps. I love that idea because I'm going to carry on thinking about that because sometimes people need invitation, don't they?
Yeah,
An invitation to do something. And that's what makes people feel like they belong in the end, actually.
yeah, yeah. But I think it's also about the energy, isn't it? Um it's about people sharing of their encounters with God and the vulnerability.
Yeah.
Um and some of the conversations or some of the ministry from Meeting for Worship for me has resonated over, I'm 58, has resonated over 50 years. Um, so I think us trusting in that, in a way, I think that's really important, isn't it? But again, how can we focus more on that and on the small groups in which those conversations happen? Again, I'm thinking of worship sharing, for example, in um, uh, Germany yearly meeting, where the kind of their exam their Swarthmore lecture had been about the Nazi period and the Kindertransport, and the kind of the the real privilege as a foreigner to be part of small conversations afterwards of people who'd been alive in that period and who were sharing in a Quaker context, and somebody sharing about his experience in a prisoner of war camp in the UK and his encounters with Quakerism then, and how very grateful and how marvelous it felt from what was quite a brutalized experience in a prisoner of war camp, and you know, after having been in the Nazi army, to be invited by a Quaker family to their home, even at the point that, the war was still going on, but to be invited back for tea, and that sense of being seen as an individual and valued as a child of God. And I think things like that, those conversations, they really nourish, don't they? And how can we have more of those conversations and really treasure that?
Mm. Well, that's great. What a wonderful, wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Catherine. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, lovely to be with you. Thank you. Bye.